everyone to Earth Day. It is our part of our Triangle Sci-Tech Expo this year. We're so excited to be here doing a full day of Earth Day programming. My name's Carrie Woke. I'm an educator here at the museum, and I'm so excited to spend this day with all of you. So before we get started, we always start our programs with an icebreaker question, and we have a really good Earth Day question for you today. So we want to know, what is your biggest concern for our environment? So go ahead and put that in the chat. And while you're answering that, I'm going to go through a quick Zoom tutorial so that we can maximize our viewing experience today. So as you can see, we are these little video cubes. And what you want to do is you want to go, well, actually, I think I'll talk about captions first. So this program is being live captioned. If you would like to view the captions, go to the bottom where it says closed caption, click that and do show subtitle. We will be recording this program. So our microphones, or all of our participants' microphones will be muted and videos will be off. Here we go about how we want you to view this. So if our videos are obscuring the slide, you can go up to the top, view options, and then you click side-by-side mode. And then you're also able to move those windows left and right. I like to have the slide bigger so that I can see it really well. And lastly, we want to hear from you. So please chat with us in the chat box. Put your questions there for our experts, put your comments there, but just keep it on topic, keep it relevant, and always be nice, be a good digital citizen. Okay, with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. And I'd like to introduce our experts today. So first of all, let me check the chat first. So what is everyone's biggest worry? Let's see, climate change, that's a really big one. I'll have to share mine. My biggest worry is the loss of biodiversity. So climate change is a close second, of course, but once biodiversity is gone, it's gone forever. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers. So Toby, Vinson, and Danielle Costantini work in the Department of Environmental Quality, and they're members of the department's Greater Resiliency Team, where they make plans for responding to storm events. So we are so excited to hear about North Carolina's plans for resiliency and all the really super cool things that are going on in the state. So Toby and Danielle, take it away.
Hi, I'm Toby Vinson. I'm with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Work in that group as an engineer. I'm an environmental engineer. For some of you looking to get into some of the work and some of these interests that our department does, and that other groups and the other departments work with as well, with our environment, for our environment. We're first off a regulatory agency, so we're sort of the gatekeepers for making sure people are doing what they're supposed to do in regard to permits and as they relate to our environment and how they may affect our environment. Another big aspect of what we do and what I do is work in permitting, but also in resilience and trying to plan where we can go as a resilient North Carolina. Part of the background for my education to get into that was, of course, trying to do really well through school. And then when I went into college, I decided to go into biological and agricultural engineering, just a big interest of mine. I planned on being an engineer, thought I was going to be an aerospace engineer to begin with, but scholarships fell in line to do something else, and it actually fell into sort of the area and background that I was very familiar with growing up on a big family farm in Eastern North Carolina. So the environment was always very important to me. So that sort of moved me into where I am now. Danielle, you want to introduce yourself real quick before we get started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Costantini. I'm joining Toby today from the Department of Environmental Quality. I'm in the State Energy Office, where we look at all things related to energy. And in that group, I'm a North Carolina STEM Fellow. So I'm here for 1 year. After completing my master's, I did both my bachelor's and master's degrees at NC State University, go Pack. And there I really focused on natural resources management with a concentration on policy. And I'm really interested both in what I did for school and in my current position, and really those intersections of science and society, which is where DEQ really comes into play. And I'm really looking forward to be speaking today. I'll join in a little bit later for kind of a case study approach, and I'll turn it over to Toby now.
Thank you. Well, let's sort of kick it off. We've been asked to, first off, happy Earth Day. Glad you're all with us. We've been asked to come speak to you about a resilient North Carolina, and where our Department of Environmental Quality stands with that, is working with that, and working towards a resilient North Carolina. So let me first kick off just by saying, hey, resilience. What is resilience? Well, if you open it up and look in the dictionary, or if you're not actually looking in the dictionary or into books and would rather look on your phone and search for it, basically the definition is going to come back as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or something's toughness. Resilience is something that engineers look at on materials too. So that's sort of where that comes from. But what does it mean for us in our department and with all the other cabinet agencies that we work with in North Carolina? That's Dancer, as well as a few other departments within the departments of state. But where do we work and where do we come in together, and how do we coordinate for a resilient North Carolina? So we came up with another definition. And that definition, as it fits the topic we're talking about today, is a resilient North Carolina. It's right there in front of you. Is a state where our communities, economies, and ecosystems are better able to rebound, positively adapt to, and thrive amid changing conditions and challenges, including disasters and climates, to maintain and improve quality of life. The big thing there is we want to conserve resources. We want to make sure everyone stays healthy. We want to make sure our durable systems are up and running, because all this makes sure that the things we need, supply and demand, work for us during all periods. And if we do have something like a natural disaster come along, we all know what hurricanes can do to the state. It will help us recover from those quicker. And we're trying to figure out ways to be resilient so that the recovery doesn't cost so much, but also doesn't take as long, and try to prevent damage to what we have, our systems that are in place, whether it's the power systems, whether it's our roads and transportation, whether it's our environment and ecosystems. So let's talk a little bit more about resilience. Where did it come from as a topic to be discussed in this current format and our current forums that we've seen going around North Carolina over the last year or two? Can we go to the next slide, Danielle? There we go. Well, it all started with Executive Order 80. Governor Cooper put this out a couple of years ago, and it's basically North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and transition to clean energy. I'm going to talk to you quite a bit about the environmental efforts and the program efforts our different divisions have been going through over the last couple of years, as well as the different coordinating agencies and committees and teams that have been put together to try to make sure all of our departments are talking together to coordinate and work and create one framework to make North Carolina more resilient. Danielle's going to speak after that and try to cover the energy aspect of how all that happens and how all that intermingles with North Carolina. Well, what you see in front of you in the 4 bullets are really the aspects and the goals set out in EO 80. The big one that we're going to talk about today, you see in green, is it recognizes that we must take an active role in combating climate change and make our state more resilient to its impacts. Climate change, what is it? Well, you've heard all different kinds of definitions for it. You've seen all kinds of different things for it. But the big thing that we're looking at is, what have we seen lately? What have we been addressing? What's been impacting us? Well, we've seen a lot of hurricanes in the last 4 or 5 years. We've seen billions of dollars of damage impacts to North Carolina and our citizens over the last 4 or 5 years that are a lot more than what we've seen in any other time going back in the past. In fact, the last 3 years in our recorded history have been the wettest 3 years in North Carolina. So, that tells us something's going on. It tells us something that we need to deal with and address. So let's go to the next slide. All right. So the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council. This was actually set up by EO80. It's made up of the secretary or his designee for each cabinet agency. So basically a cabinet agency for students in the audience today, those are the heads of the departments that are appointed by the government or by the governor. Separate from council of state, which are the heads of departments that are elected. So the council chair for this council is the secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality. We'll hopefully have a good confirmation hearing with our upcoming secretary, Ms. Delegati, tomorrow. We're looking forward to that. Council duties for this council, as you can see here, basically put it in a nutshell, they tell all of us to work together to try to address climate change. They tell us to all work together to try to address energy issues. And they also tell us to make sure we're not doing it from a top-down approach. The big thing there is we want to involve all the communities. The communities are what are impacted, and the communities know what they need to make themselves resilient. And so it's got to be an entire framework from the top down and the bottom up and filling everything in between for this to work. So can we go on to the next slide? Okay, EO80, section 9. There are several sections in Executive Order 80. That's what the EO80 is. You may hear me refer to it as that several times today. But it addressed many things. It talked about electric vehicles, converting to zero emission vehicles. It talks about addressing energy in a state energy plan, which Danielle will talk about later. But it also talked about our climate science report, impacts by climate and natural disasters. What are our risks? What's vulnerable in North Carolina? What can we make those vulnerable? What can we do to make those vulnerable things less vulnerable so that we don't have to pay and keep repaying to fix them after every natural disaster? So, what can we do to adapt? What is resiliency? How can we get to a resilient North Carolina? So let's move on through the next slide, please. So the directives that were set out in EO80 and by the council was the Department of Environmental Quality and cabinet agencies, risk climate assessment and resiliency plan. That's the first and biggest thing that the council put together and had all the agencies come together. And this included not only the cabinet agencies, but we had several council of state agencies involved in this as well. This was completed on March 1 and turned in March 1 of 2020. But it provided a scientific assessment of current projected climate impacts on North Carolina. Not only did it get into just the big picture, it actually got into some detail as to how each agency has seen impacts and the clients of each agency, which are the citizens of the state, the businesses of the state, are affected and impacted. And it went in and addressed and assessed that to see how can we make sure or reduce those impacts for our citizens, for our businesses, to keep North Carolina going. So we all had to go in and address those. How do our agencies continue to function during those systems? So it required us to look at and determine and figure out continuation of operations. When storms hit, when the natural disasters hit, whether it's hurricane, tornadoes, heavy winters where power goes out, like the latest example is what happened in Texas this past year. When those happen, how do we continue operations? And by continue operations, I mean, how do we keep providing the services that the public expects, even through those situations? We were required to go through and look at that and address that and write a report to assess it. Well, we came up with a lot of things, but that's basically the ground floor. That's the foundation. That's what gets us started. So let's go on to the next slide if we could. So where are we now?
Can I interrupt? Can I interrupt
sure.
a question?
Got a question?
I do.
Sure.
I have a question. So, yeah, so we're all familiar with what happened in Texas. Is there something, could that happen here in North Carolina? I know Texas had a pretty unique power grid.
Yeah, well, I would never say it could not happen here, but Texas power system and the way they're organized is a lot different than the way North Carolina is. Texas was deregulated in many areas, and the areas that were regulated have to have tie-ins, and that's where the areas that had tie-ins to some of the neighboring states, they didn't have problems. But those that were, in a deregulated system where they didn't necessarily have to have tie-ins, they had some issues. And of course, they also, because they were further south, some of those power companies thought that they might be able to save costs by reducing some of the maintenance items. In other words, can they have systems that they don't have to winterize? And that's where we saw that's where they saw some of the failures occur. I've got some very close friends in Texas, in Austin, that actually work for the power companies, and they're sitting there scratching their heads, wondering, why didn't we think of this, or why wasn't it covered? So, is it likely to happen here? Well, we get hit like that during hurricanes all the time, but our recovery is pretty well. Our grid systems are set up so that we can get crews in to work on things, but we still have people that might wait 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks to get power back on. That's what we see after natural disasters. We're used to hurricanes in North Carolina. Could what happen in Texas? Sure, it could happen anywhere. We haven't gotten to the extent with wind that they have, but we have with solar. Solar, we're pushing solar. It's coming up in North Carolina all over the place, but the wind hasn't quite gotten there yet. So some of the issues they saw, we shouldn't have, but keep fingers crossed. Maybe Danielle will cover that a little later.
Yeah, so I guess I have a follow-up question. So where is our weakest link in our resiliency?
Where's the weakest link? Well, it sort of depends on what you're looking at and where you want to go. What's your favorite topic? Our weakest link sort of depends and falls back on what your biggest, it comes to a personal favorites. What do I demand? What do I want? And what is that supply that's available? Power can be an issue. Transportation can be an issue. Those are two of the biggest things that are addressed when you're looking at resilience, because without power, what you have with what you don't have without power. But transportation, our roads, railroads, and air, are they able to move? Are they able to get around? Are they able to function? Because they're the ones that are delivering goods and supplies for recovery, for food and water. That's that base foundation. So those are some really big items in it. But where does everything else fit in it? Because a lot of those other things are some of those supplies that need to be provided, and if those are impacted, doesn't matter if transportation's up and running. Those things, the supply side's down. So that I don't think you can narrow it down to one thing, but the two that I named are really big ones. Any other questions before I jump back in?
I think that's all we have for right now.
Okay, so where are we now? Talked about the risk assessment and resilience plan already, that the council and the EO80 had us go in and address. And please forgive me, you'll hear me using all kinds of acronyms today, and I'll try to make sure I actually verbalize the entire name of whatever I'm talking about. DEQ, that's the Department of Environmental Quality. If you're ever talking with government officials, bureaucrats, or the military, we're full of acronyms. And a lot of times our acronyms may cross over, and when we meet with each other, we have to give each other definitions because they don't mean the same thing. But part of what came out of EO80 is, when I talk about where are we now, is part of that requirement is that we do an annual report, every cabinet agency, and then of course any council state agency that wants to continue to join us provides an annual agency resilience strategy report. Those were supplied and required this year, and they were due March 1. They'll be due March 1 of every year. That's actually been published. I believe our NCORE, which is North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience, has published that and provided that to the governor, and they've made that public, I believe, already. So each one of these strategy reports for every department of state, or I'm sorry, for every cabinet agency is out there and ready for reading and reported. And it gives a lot more detail than I'm going to give you in this presentation today. But the other things that are out there is, the Climate Change Resiliency Council that the governor set up in EO 80. They're still out there. They didn't stop after the report was done. They're still out there keeping an eye on us and helping us coordinate. But also what was created out of that report was the interagency resilience team. Those are the people within each department that are working together to cut down the silos and making sure that we're getting the most benefit out of the cost for what we're trying to create with a resilient state. And then there's also a recovery support function group, the RSFs. There are actually several of them throughout the state. The one that works with our department most closely is RSF group number 7, which is for environmental preservation. We work quite closely with North Carolina Emergency Management and NCORE with that. So next slide. So when we talk about where are we now, we need to consider, what are we trying to prevent? What are our hardships? Well, you heard me talk about hurricanes. You heard me go through some of those. Well, let's take a look at just, Hurricane Florence impacts. We've had Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Matthew before Florence. And then, many of your friends, family, if you've been around as long as I have, you remember Hurricanes Fran, Floyd, Hugo. Of course, get back to my mom's age, she'll talk about Hazel. So, we've had hurricanes all through our lives and all through our history in North Carolina. We've just seen major impacts over the last several years from those hurricanes, and we're addressing them, and we're trying to address them in a very organized and efficient manner, because the studies that we've looked at, there's a cost of recovery after damage. Well, part of what we're finding is that if we put money in resilience planning up front, it can reduce the damage and thus reduce the overall cost of recovery or impact by the natural disaster or whatever else is happening or causing a problem. So, if we look at this, what are we trying to prevent? Well, $17 billion in estimated damages statewide in North Carolina. People being displaced from their homes, having to go to shelters. We had over 21,000 people sheltered during Hurricane Florence. Had over 5,000 people that had to be rescued by boat, by land, by high clearance vehicles, or by air. What was kind of neat about that is, I think that's the first time we were actually using drones to direct rescue operations to find people that might have been stuck in the tops of their houses or within their attic space, which was really neat. Some of those new technologies are being deployed and employed by the different agencies on an ongoing basis now. So next slide, please. All right, another thing, what are we trying to prevent? This is a really good map. If you watch the video of this, you can look at it, pull it, save it. But these are all the counties that were impacted by Hurricanes Matthew, Michael, Florence. You can see where some counties were hit multiple times, but it's a really good picture of all the counties that were hit by the 3 different hurricanes that we're looking at there. Through those 3, 77 of our 100 counties were declared disaster areas. These were just disaster declaration. Doesn't mean they weren't impacted at all. It just means that these were bad enough to be declared disaster areas by the president and by FEMA. Next question, please, or next slide, please. Again, this is another little figure that if you look at it, it's sort of the cost of impact. Each one of these years for North Carolina, you can see from 2011 forward, we got each one of the colors identified. They're actually tracking the number of billion-dollar disaster events in the United States. Well, those different colored ones that you see in the slides are for everything that's going on around the country, and you can see where the average is the black line at the base. Well, if what we're seeing hitting there in the U.S., during 2020, we don't even have all the records yet. We had over $16 billion impacts before September of that year. So, we're seeing increases of way above average. So that's a concern. That's where we're trying to get to a resilient state so we can start preventing and bringing some of those numbers down. Next slide. Okay. I talked about the North Carolina or the Department of Environmental Quality's Agency Resilience Strategy Report. I got a few slides with a few pictures to show you some impacts from some of the latest storms and hurricanes we had, but also I wanted to point out some quotes from that report. In this one, each division is highlighted in this report the many and varied priorities that not only help accomplish the base duties and expectations of their programs as outlined by statute, rule, and policy. Basically, what we're saying there is, not only are we accomplishing the duties that the laws require us to do, but we've also gone in and identified priorities that the department sees as having key role in moving North Carolina into a state of resilience and away from a state of reaction. That really sort of hit me as a really important statement that the department made about moving forward with resilience and how can we not only address what we're doing that's part of our mission, but using that mission to create resilience in North Carolina. Next slide. One other quote from that report is basically talks about the relationship that we are creating with all the interagencies and other departments. So, we're actively involved in interagency council meetings. I mentioned that already. We're dedicated to coordinating with the interagency resilience team to work on cross-sector resilience strategies and actively leading and participating in the environmental preservation response support function group with emergency management. So DEQ sees all these efforts as important and necessary to effectively accomplish its goals and the mission, but also to make sure we're not just meeting the mission that's set out by the law, but using that mission to make sure we're trying to become a more resilient state again as well. The following slides are a few of those strategies by some of our divisions within our department. Next slide. So DCM, I told you we have a lot of acronyms. Well, that's the Division of Coastal Management. That's one of the agencies within the Department of Environmental Quality. What I've done is highlight a couple of the resilient strategies that they are implementing at this time to make North Carolina a better place. The first one, they built website and host tools to help planners assess vulnerability and continue to coordinate the North Carolina sea level rise assessment reports. Coastal Management has also partnered with emergency management to double the number of tide gauges that can be used to measure long-term sea level rise. So they've actually gone out and they're putting tidal gauges on the coast and along the coast so that they can keep track and measure sea level rise. And they've gone on their websites. If you want to go to any of our departments' websites and go to our divisions, you can see some of these projects that they have going on. We're proud of them. We're advertising them. We want you to know what we're doing. What you see in green, the green bullet point, this is a project where they've created a resilient coastal community program, which incentivizes and rewards communities for meeting defined standards for long-term planning, preparedness, and community engagement. This is a project, the reason it's in green is because it's one of the projects that was not only identified as a need in the EO80 report and our strategy report, but it has just now received some funding to expand it even further through some efforts with our North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience, as well as the HUD CDBG grants that are available to the state that have come through. So we've been able to fund some of these, and it was identified as a fundamental framework that needs to be addressed so that we have a good foundation to move through creating a resilient framework to address flooding, to address impacts on the coast in this case, and to join with other with other projects to make a really good, strong web and net to try to protect the state. Next slide, please. All right, our Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources. I was nice and didn't put the acronym in there for us, but they've got several things going on, highlighted 3 things here. They're in the middle of a hydrologic and hydraulic capacity overtopping study for 550 large and very large dams that are in our Neuse River Basin, Lumber, and Cape Fear River Basins. To give you a little bit of background, North Carolina's got over 6,000 dams that we've identified. There are more than that, but we regulate a little over 3,000 of them. And of those, 1,500 of those are what we call high hazard dams. North Carolina, by the way, and it's just for some background information, is one of the top 5 states in the nation for total number of dams in the state and total number of high hazard dams in the state. And they're in all kinds of different conditions. High hazard doesn't mean it's going to fail. High hazard means that if it were to fail, it's going to cause over $200,000 in damage or loss of life. And that's what we're trying to prevent. And that's what this study helps to cover. Also,
so Toby, can I ask some questions about dams?
Sure.
So I do have a question. I know, so a lot of dams are being removed. Now, would that help with resiliency if the dams were removed? Because I know for wildlife and fish, removing dams can be a good thing.
One of the big things when dams are actually in stream networks, run of river style dams, they can cause problems with ecology, with fish being able to swim up and downstream. Some dams that are older don't have systems or fish ladders for the fish to be able to get up and downstream for spawning, for their ecosystems. So that has caused some issues in certain areas. Populations get separated, that kind of thing. So when those dams are removed, the thought and the science there is that it's going to improve that ecosystem and make it a little bit better. Those types of dams, a lot of times they're in place for hydropower, not so much flood control. Sometimes, you might see that are some that are in flood control, but some of those you might see more that are offline on smaller streams that go to the larger rivers or creeks. And those may be for flood control. So, when you're deciding on having a dam or not having a dam, you have to take all that into account to determine, is it, what are we protecting, or what's the dam being used for, and does it meet the needs of the community and state as a whole? So those are some of the things that the people that build dams, have dams and maintain dams, have to take that under consideration, and we have to take it under consideration in our permit. Any other questions about dams?
Let's see.
I can talk about dams all day.
I think we're good on dam questions.
All righty. One of the other programs in the Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources is our landslide mapping program. That's part of our North Carolina Geological Survey, which, by the way, is the oldest geological survey in the nation. It's older than USGS. It's been around since 1823. These guys are very proud of that fact, and they're very happy to work with all the other agencies that they work with. But one of the things that we've identified that we've always had some issue with, but it's become a bigger issue, like I said, in the last 5 years, is landslides. And so we're actually out there trying to map sensitive zones so that people know what the risk is and what their vulnerability is. And part of that work is also putting that information on an interactive map on our website. So if you go to the DEQ website and go to our Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources, you'll find Geological Survey, and you can find these interactive maps that tell you give you all kinds of really neat information, especially if you're into rocks and geology. This last bullet you see is in green again. This is another funded study. I'm back at the acronyms, PMP. For those of you that don't know what that is, that stands for probable maximum precipitation. If you can guess, during the last 2 or 3 hurricanes, we've had some areas of the state that received the probable maximum precipitation. What that means is that's about the biggest storm that they can have. We had areas that had over 36 inches of rain. If you remember when hurricanes hit Texas, Houston had over 51 inches. That was their probable maximum precipitation. These things don't happen very often. A PMP is a much bigger event than a 1,000-year storm. So, because this study needs to be done on count, the last time it was done it's about 50 years old, 40 to 50 years old. And this study needs to be replaced to address all the big storms we've had since this was put together back in I'm trying to remember if it was 60s or 70s when it was completed. Might have been early 80s, but there's a lot that's happened where this study needs to be brought up, because this study can be used by communities, town planners, state planners, permitting groups to determine the best needs for our infrastructure, putting in water lines, sewer lines, streets, roads, communications, power. This is great information to have for that. This is, again, one of those foundational studies that needs to be updated, which, with the funding now, we're moving forward to it. Next slide. Mitigation services. The Division of Mitigation Services within our department, they're one of the fund groups. They're non-regulatory. They get to go out and rebuild streams. The a straight line's the shortest distance between 2 points. Well, that doesn't work well in mitigation or stream flow, because straight line means water flows faster. So what they do is they go out and they try to recreate some of these streams that have been straightened out by development. When people get involved, we want to get the stream out of the way, so we put it in a straight line so we have a nice big area to do whatever we want to do with. Well, they go back in and naturalize it. So, they create sinuosity. Well, that's one thing that they've done since the beginning. A couple of years ago, the legislature gave them the authority to develop a program to create flood storage using nature-based solutions. So that's looking at what's in the floodplain. Can things be moved out of the floodplain? Are there nature-based riparian areas? Can you put trees in? Can you create wetlands that are in these floodplains to help attenuate flood or flooding and flooding impacts? So that's what they're looking at with it. Really neat science and really neat projects we hope will come out of that. Next slide. All right, our Division of Waste Management. People wonder, what does waste management, where do they fit in the whole resilience page? Well, they fit quite well into it. They're the ones that everybody wants to talk to after natural disaster, because, what happens? Things get torn up, things get damaged, and things have to be thrown away, trashed. Do they go to recycle? Do they go to landfills? What happens? Well, this group works with all the local communities to identify waste areas for them to take all these waste that have to be removed quickly. And what they're trying to do is create systems such that this is already known, this is already set up. Also, how can we reduce some of this waste up front so it doesn't become a disaster issue? And so they're working with the local communities to try to work through some of those items to have them taken care of and address them before we have the problems. Next slide. Water resources. This is our division, water resources. A couple of things they've got going on are evaluating potential for statewide buffers to mitigate against effects of extreme storm events. Well, water buffers, riparian buffers, these are areas between our surface waters and the places where we as humans have our activities. And the things we do can pollute the air, they can pollute the water. Well, if we create these buffers, we can have grasses, plants, trees take up some of these things and absorb and deal with the excess rain events and any pollutants that might be there, but they also help buffer temperatures when weather gets hot. That helps the ecosystem and local stream habitat. One of the other big ones, you see it in green again, is one of the things that we're going to be implementing that we're hoping is going to get funded pretty soon. We've got some good recommendations up. On this one, we don't have final approval yet, but some of you may or may not have heard of the 7Q10. Well, this is the average low flow for a stream over a 10-year period. So basically the things that are addressed in the 7Q10, it helps to calculate waste load allocations. So in other words, those of you don't have septic tanks in your backyards, your waste will go to a wastewater treatment plant. Well, they're allowed to discharge from these treatment plants or from other pollutant discharges at a certain level. You know, you've heard the term dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, that still has to be used and followed in many aspects of our water management, because you know there's certain levels that you can and can't get some of these pollutants down to. But what we do with our permits is set the maximum amounts that you're allowed to discharge, and you have to have a certain flow for it to mix with, so that it's not causing pollution problems that are going to impact our environment and us. And that's what the 7Q10 helps to address, because it looks at droughty areas and looks at drought situations so that we can help figure worst case scenarios. People ask, well, why are you worried about 7Q10 if we've got climate change and we're seeing more rain than we've seen ever? Well, some areas are seeing more rain than they've seen ever. However, there's still some other areas that may go through drought situations at any given time. And because of that, we still need to address this worst case scenario. So that's sort of what that project is going to help determine, help take care of. Next slide. Climate Change Resiliency Council. I talked about this at the beginning of my talk. They weren't there just to get us going and get us started with a report that came out for EO80. They're actually there making sure that all of us other agencies are still talking and communicating with each other and reporting back to them, so they can report to the governor on what our accomplishments are. What are we doing? How are we breaking down these silos? They're giving guidance to the agencies and telling the agencies, hey, you guys work together. And then an interagency resilience team on framework coordination, and then also giving recommendations up for possible legislation that'll help improve all this. This is partnered, like I said, and led by our department. Next slide. Interagency resilience team. Well, again, that's the group I told you that's, all of us folks that are within each of the departments coming together, working together, telling each other what we're doing, so that we can use that as tools within our own departments. I can take from what Natural Cultural Resources is doing. Hey, this is a great idea. I want to use it in DEQ. Tell me what you're doing, because I want to implement that. So, we're working on that, but we're also working on bigger things for our other clients and customers around the state. Next slide. All right, the Recovery Support Function Group 7. This is the group that actually made the recommendations for funding on all those green bullets that you saw in those earlier slides. This is a group made up of key state agencies, both cabinet and council of state. But we also have a lot of volunteer. There's another acronym NGO. That's a non-government organization. We've got lots of those involved with us, helping to make those recommendations. They represent communities. They represent different environmental groups to help give advice and assist on a lot of things that we do. That one, of course, is led by our department along with the NCORE. And so we're taking those recommended strategies and frameworks to try to make them work for North Carolina. Next. And I'm going to turn it over to Danielle here. Danielle, it's all yours.
Thanks, Toby. So he provided a really great overview of what a lot of different divisions in DEQ are doing. And I'm going to give you all a little bit more examples of what one particular division's doing, the State Energy Office where I work, so you can get a little bit better idea of on the ground what goes into a lot of these strategies and actions that Toby just discussed. And so when we're thinking about resiliency, especially in communities, so towns, cities, counties, even regions, the effects on people and those municipalities and counties are what a lot of people are concerned about. And this is sort of 7 different buckets we consider as being essential services and community lifelines to communities. So there's things like emergency services, law enforcement, fire department, there's food, water, and shelter, health and medical, making sure people are able to get to hospitals if they need them, energy, which I'll talk about today, communications, transportation, and then hazardous materials. And when we're at the State Energy Office and we're thinking about resiliency, we see energy as really being interconnected with these other community lifelines, as well as things like transportation, food, water, and shelter, and really integral to the foundation of recovering from storms. And this diagram is really complicated because it's supposed to be to show how interconnected all of these community lifelines and essential critical infrastructure are, and how electricity really supports these other functions. So if the electricity goes out, communications like cell towers, Wi-Fi and internet can go down, making it hard to call emergency services, making it difficult to reach your family and loved ones to make sure they're okay. Similarly, if the electricity goes down, emergency services might not be able to be deployed. Traffic lights go down, which can cause further accidents. Water treatment centers can fail if the power goes out. And you're really reliant upon sort of oil and natural gas transportation to be able to support the electricity grid when it goes down. And when we're looking at the grid and what sort of the hazards and threats are to our current energy grid, there's non-climate stressors. There's things that aren't related to climate, like population growth. The more people there are, the more people are using electricity, the more stress there is on the grid. There's aging infrastructure. So some of these buildings are old, which means it's not updated with the newest efficient technology. There's divides between rural, and urban parts of our state. So in rural parts of our state, it might take longer for repairs to be made, or there might be less funding available. And then there's things like pandemics that come, as we've all seen, that affect our grid and how we interact with energy. If you're all home more, working from home, or doing school at home, you're using a lot more energy than you might have been otherwise. And then on top of those non-climate stressors, there are climate stressors, which we explore a lot in that risk and resiliency plan that Toby mentioned, and the North Carolina Climate Science Report, which is a section of that. And we're looking at things like sea level rise, higher heat in the summer, more rain, which causes flooding, hurricanes that are increasing in intensity and frequency, droughts, and then inland flooding as well as coastal flooding. So there's a lot of stressors on our grid that provides this energy that's essential to all these different functions in our society. And you saw this slide with Toby, but I'll focus more on the energy impacts. Florence was the largest mobilization effort in Duke Energy storm history. So especially when it hit those coastal communities, they really had to rapidly mobilize and deploy those that would go out and repair transmission lines. So the power lines above ground and underground. They had 9 substations that were flooded. So those are the more like regional hubs where energy goes through to provide communities with energy. Individual homes, there were over 1 million, I think it was over 1.5 million outages reported. And then if we look at specific counties, those numbers were even higher and a little bit scarier. So like in New Hanover County, over 100,000 people lost power for at least 3 days, some up to 2 weeks. Due to a lot of the flooding, a lot of the major highways in and out of New Hanover County were inaccessible, making it an island for a few days. And that meant that fuel couldn't be transported into the county. So a lot of these backup generators run on diesel. And when they began to run out of diesel, there wasn't a way to get more. So shelters started running out of power, which were supposed to be in place to help people who were already experiencing power outages in their other homes or flooding in their homes. And then in New Hanover County, a wastewater treatment plant lost power. And due to that, millions of gallons of partially treated wastewater were released into the Cape Fear River. So again, there's a lot of sort of cascading effects that happen to these other really important sectors when energy is disrupted in the state due to storms. So Toby mentioned the risk and resiliency plan, and something else that came out of Executive Order 80 was our clean energy plan, which really focuses on a transition to a clean energy economy. So reducing our greenhouse gas and carbon emissions, and instead shifting to those that are more carbon neutral, like solar and wind. And a really key recommendation in this plan, which goes hand in hand with that risk and resiliency plan, was to modernize the grid to support clean energy resources, but also to make sure we have a resilient grid, which clean energy options really help with. And these next 3 bullets, I'll go into more detail in the next slides, but we're looking at solutions like microgrids and distributed energy resources coordinating resiliency planning with communities, and then really being able to quantify the human costs of power outages. So all those cascading effects we talked about, what do those really cost people in their everyday lives, and then governments as they're looking at recovery options, and how do we minimize those costs up front?
Danielle, can I interrupt with a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I went to a meeting that is called We Are Still In, and that is the Paris Climate Accord, which just heard that we rejoined today. So that's very exciting. But one of the messages that I heard so strongly there was that so many like businesses in North Carolina want to claim that they are 100% renewable energy, yet it's so hard to get that right in our current state. So what are our state plans for adding that clean energy to the grid so that we, so somebody can say, hey, listen, we're 100% renewable. So they can use that as like a marketing thing.
Yeah, it's really an all hands on deck approach to this, right? The government can't just say, we're going to do all this and have a clean energy economy without everyone really being involved and participating. And North Carolina was really ahead of the game. The Paris Accord, when the US withdrew 4 years ago now, North Carolina still maintained that commitment under Executive Order 80. So they've been planning for this for the past 3 to 4 years, and that's where this Clean Energy Plan and Risk and Resiliency Plan came out of. And there's a lot of different strategies and potential solutions that we're still exploring. And it's really requires an investment from the business community to recognize, right, they want to make that change, not just say they want to, but actually doing the change. And thinking strategically for the long term. This isn't something you can do in 2 to 3 years to shift to 100% renewables, but we're looking at more like the 2050 timeline. So it's really a willingness to work together with everyone, including the government and local communities, local governments, and industry to find solutions, one of which I'll talk about on the next slide, which we're exploring a little bit more. Anything else?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So one of these strategies that the State Energy Office is using to look at resiliency and clean energy is called Community Energy Resiliency Planning, which is really looking at a local level for what the needs are of each community and the businesses and people that live in those communities. North Carolina has a few different options for how people get their energy. There's large companies like Duke Energy that provide a lot of the urban population with power. There's electric co-ops, which work in more rural counties. There's municipality-owned electricity, so some cities actually own their own power generation and distribution. So each place is a little bit different in how they get their energy. So it's really being able to work with community, and that means government and industry, to look at where are their energy assets, which is this map. You can see we have solar, there's coal up in this northern part of the state. The lines are all the transmission and distribution lines. So looking at where those energy assets are, overlaying that at a local level with where the community critical infrastructure are that we talked about a few slides ago. So where are your fire departments? Where are these shelters? Where are grocery stores that need to keep power? And then adding in these climate threats. So what facilities, what houses, what community centers are likely to flood when a category 1 to 3 hurricane comes or a 4 to 5 hurricane comes. So it's looking at this local level to really prioritize prioritize with local communities what's important to them. And when they're thinking about resiliency, how are they going to respond? And then starting to think about solutions. So if the grocery store or a hospital loses power, how are we going to keep that running? How are we going to get diesel or a different source of energy to that specific building so that we can keep treating people as they're coming in with storm-related injuries? And we're really big proponents, obviously, of these clean energy solutions. So looking at solar and what we call microgrids, so these smaller solar panel arrays that you can really integrate to the grid and power either an individual building or a small sort of collection of buildings that are geographically close. when storms come, being able to build those and identify what parts of a city would most benefit from these solutions, that we think clean energy solutions would be a better option for than diesel, which again, looking at New Hanover County, when you couldn't get diesel into the county, people went without power that were working on backup generators. So things like microgrids, which have batteries that store the power for several days and collect the solar power, that would be able to run these buildings for several days, up to several weeks without power. That are those essential community lifelines we discussed. And then the third sort of pillar that we look at is how do we integrate these smaller scale solutions into a statewide approach? So you have your traditional grid energy service providers. They have their own plans for how power is going to be delivered to communities in the face of storms, but they all kind of are siloed and they work in their own individual way. So it's really bringing together these industry partners with the community partners who are working on resiliency and looking at the long-term solutions like we just talked about, how we make sure communities are prepared, how we make sure the industry and companies are prepared, and how they can work together in the face of storms so that some buildings, the yellow ones here in this picture, might still be supplied with traditional power when storms are going on, but ones that have these solutions like microgrids that are solar panels might be able to operate off of the grid for a few days, and maybe power is diverted to other places that don't have those options. So it's really looking at this statewide holistic approach, and again, the long-term approach, looking towards 2050 even, as we're trying to be more carbon neutral. And with that, I will turn it back over to Toby for where the state is going and where DEQ is going.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for that information too. You told me some stuff that I wasn't aware of, so it's always good to get that new information, even in house. But where are we going? Here's a nice little slide. Sort of shows you what we've done. Some of the things that we've done. We've explored hazards. We're still doing that. For example, with our landslide mapping crew, we're still exploring those hazards, trying to identify those. We've got groups still trying to explore hazards for impacts for local communities too. So, we're going to keep working on that. But, we've already identified a lot of those. We did that in our risk assessment resilience report. Assess vulnerabilities and risks. The bulk of that work we put together in that same project, that same plan, but we're continuing to work on it because, it's going to take a while to identify everything and how everything's interconnected. Some of the reports and projects that I've shown you already, it talks about investigating options. Well, those options are talking about, cost benefit. We have to do some cost benefit analysis to see, what's worthwhile, what's going to work, and also to make sure we're communicating with the local communities so that, not everybody's got the same fix. Not everybody needs the same fix. So, that's the key reason that we coordinate and communicate with all the different local communities to figure out what's going to work where. And then prioritize and plan. That's where we are now. We're setting priorities. We're trying to put funding together for these foundational plans and projects that we've identified, some of which we've identified today. And we're going to continue to plan, with the council, with the interagency resilience team, with the recovery support function groups that we're all involved in. That's putting not only all of our agencies talking to each other, but that's putting us talking to the communities. That's putting us talking to the universities, academia. That's got us talking with non-governmental organizations that have great ideas. And they're trying to find outlets to get some of these things done and identify what's going to work for North Carolina. And finally, where are we now? We're at the take action side. We've got projects now. We're putting, boots on the ground. We've got shovels getting some projects done, and we've got our consultants, our engineers, our geologists, our hydrogeologists, and all of our scientists, working with academia to get these studies done, to take action, to set this foundation and build this framework. As we go, we'll probably be providing more and more recommendations up the ladder to management, and then also across the street to to the governor and eventually to the General Assembly for us to look at and start promoting some of these thoughts, ideas, to plans to move us into a resilient state. And so that's where we are, and that's where we're going. And when I don't know that we'll ever completely get there, because we'll as we improve, as we meet our goals, we'll start setting higher standards and setting higher goals. And so this isn't meant to be a standstill situation. We'll get there and it's done. It's going to be well, first off, part of the journey is getting to our goals and meeting our goals now and setting them. Once we get there, do we raise the bar? So we'll worry about that when we get there, but let's not forget about that before we do get there. I think that's about it, isn't it, Danielle?
Yes, this is just our thank you slide, and I don't know, I think we cut it really close to 1, but if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to either of us and we'd be happy to talk more.
Yes, thank you both so much. What an absolutely fascinating glimpse into all the wonderful plans that our state has for resiliency and dealing with the effects of climate change and other things, natural disasters, or unnatural. But so thank you very much for joining us on this Earth Day. We are out of time, but if you do have questions, their contact information is on the slide, and you can also feel free to reach out to me as well. I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for the Triangle SciTech Expo, the Biogen Foundation, and the North Carolina Science Festival, which we are a part of and very happy to be so. I also want to thank all of our museum members. Your membership is what allows us to do programming like this. So thank you so much. We hope that you're able to join us for more Earth Day programs today. And SciTech keeps going through Saturday. So please keep joining us for more programs, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.